Okay. So we are live. Hi, everyone out there on the internet, and hi, everyone here in the room. So welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. Today we're talking about population growth and potentially overpopulation, and how basic income fits into the picture. Does giving everyone free money make the population problem worse? To what extent is there a population problem in the first place? A bunch of us watched a video by statistician Hans Rosling. And hey, Bethany. So Bethany is actually going to be leading our discussion tonight, but while she gets set up, we can kind of start.
You haven't started the live stream.
We have started the live stream.
Wait, really? Doesn't it start at
7:05.
Is it 7:05?
Yeah. So everyone on the internet can see you being late.
I had really good reasons.
I know. I saw your
All my
text.
student
It's okay.
presentations are over.
It's okay. Yeah, so I kind of want to, let's start while Bethany's getting set up. Let's go around the room, and I want to get everyone's thoughts on what they think the population situation is, and well, I'll let you get set up. Do you think there's a problem with population growing too much in the world, or is the population too high? And what are some ways we can handle that? And how does basic income fit in? If you are pro basic income, are you worried that it could have negative side effects on the size of the population and that kind of thing? So just general thoughts about population growth and basic income and potentially how they're related.
Let me add something, which is that if you saw the Hans Rosling video, maybe skip the first question about the state of population growth, since he basically answers it.
All right, that's a fair point. So don't talk about the current state of population growth, but maybe talk about basic incomes.
Well, who's seen that Hans Rosling video?
I think, did
Not
it?
recently.
All right, so we'll start with Roma because he hasn't seen it.
Mm-hmm.
Nice to see you, by the way.
Yeah, good to see you, Bethany. So one of the reasons why I had an opportunity to come, but also I'm interested in the subject, and I admit I am biased, and one of the reasons why I'm looking forward to this is to try to keep an open mind and see if I can be convinced otherwise. But I think population is one of the biggest problems in our world today, because it's the thing that is responsible for environmental degradation, which I think is a huge issue. I have not given much thought to the effect of a basic income on overpopulation, but it does make me a bit worried. I'm curious to learn how the different scenarios may play out in terms of what people think.
Cool. Robert, what do you think?
I guess just in the sense of Mother Nature only produces a finite amount of resources that we as humans can consume. So if the population is expanding at, I don't know what the rate is, I forget what he says in the video, but I know it's growing rapidly. So I worry about the rate of consumption of natural resources and what kind of implications that may have down the road. Similar to Roma, also haven't really factored in how basic income would tie into a growing population, but I guess we'll get into that tonight.
Richard.
I actually believe that the introduction of a basic income would decrease the overall population in 100 years or 50 years or whatever, because higher educational attainment would mean that there's more knowledge about how, like in the video, they show like methods of birth control and things like that. Mm-hmm. So, and well, when women are ignorant of such things, that they cede all control to their husbands and they produce as many children as possible. And with the access to money, they would actually have better health outcomes, and that would reduce the number of children that parents would feel necessary to produce, because there's higher survival rate.
Okay. I would say that it's hard to say how basic income would affect population growth. I could certainly imagine a scenario in which everybody has more money to spend and now they can afford more children. And certainly if we're giving basic income to literally everyone, including babies, then, we're paying people to have children almost. So that might be something we want to talk about in terms of, how do you want to restrict the basic income so it doesn't create these kinds of perverse incentives. I agree that we have like an environmental problem and humanity is having, an adverse impact on the climate and the planet and all of that. I don't know how much of that is it actually coming from the size of the population as opposed to how the population is kind of behaving in the environment. So for example, I talk a lot about how we're using economic policies to make up unnecessary jobs for people. So I think we're wasting a lot of resources in a lot of industries that are not ultimately producing that much value for the economy. And we're doing it in the name of, providing people a way to earn money as an excuse to give them spending money. So if we have less of that, if we have fewer people kind of commuting to jobs every day and contributing to emissions in that way, and just the resources that go into all these industries that might not be actually necessary for the economy, if basic income can help us say, hey, maybe we don't need to be doing all this extra unnecessary stuff, then that can help mitigate our impact on the planet as well. We have something like 8 billion people on the planet right now.
7.3.
7.3, only 7.3? Oh, I started rounding up too early. So for the number of people we have on the planet, and Hans Rosling says we're going to cap out at about 10 or 11 billion, I'm not convinced that we can't sustain that number of people on the planet. Certainly a smaller population than that wouldn't hurt, but I'm not too worried about it. So that's basically my take.
Great. I'm wondering how to have everybody sit so that I can see you. What was your name again?
I'm Robert.
Robert, because you're like directly in my line.
I can
back up a little bit.
Alex, I fundamentally disagree with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's start. I want to start by getting everyone on the same page with what I think is the best example of the facts. I think Hans Rosling does a really great job kind of on where we stand now, which is different from how basic income might change things or how things might change. But where do we stand now on population growth? So I just have a clip or two from the video that goes through that. And that way we'll be on the same page with that and we can kind of discuss it in relationship to what might happen.
And how did we get here? I'm going to tell you a story about everyone who ever lived. Well,
Technology-wise.
two axes. This is time in years. And this one here is world population in billions. In the year 10,000 BC, when the first people were becoming farmers, then the archaeologists estimate that the world population was only 10 million. Imagine 10 million, that's like Sweden today. A world of only Swedes. But then, as the millennia passed by, more farmers, food and people, and great empires could emerge. Egypt, China, India, and finally Europe. And population continued to grow, but very slowly. And I stop here at the year 1800, because 1800, that's when world population became 1 billion. Imagine all that time, the population growth was just with a tiny fraction of a percent through thousands of years. But here, 1800, with the Industrial Revolution, everything changed and population started to grow faster. In little more than 100 years, it reached 2 billion. And then, when I was at school, it was 3 billion. And many people said, the planet cannot support more people. Even experts said that. But what happens was this, we became 4 billion, 5 billion, 6 billion, 7 billion. Imagine, more than half of the world population have been added during my lifetime. And the number is still rising.
So that's one part, but here's the second part.
From the finest demographers we have at the Population Division of the United Nations. And it looks like this. It's going to continue first up to 8, and then it goes up to 9, and then it goes here. But see, it's slowing down, it's slowing down. By the end of the century, it's becoming more flat there. And if I do a close-up on this, you can see that we are expecting a slowing down and the end of fast population growth. But of course, this is a projection that has a certain degree of uncertainty. But we are sure that we are at the end of fast population growth within this century. It's all due to a remarkable effect of the falling fertility rate. Look here, if we go back into this. I'll show this by showing you the number of children in the world. The number of children from 0 to 15 years of age. Here they come. Look, the number of children there increased slowly, and then also it increased rapidly. So by the turn of the century here, there were 2 billion children in the world. And to me, that was an important year because that was when Doris was born. That's my first grandchild. And she was born at a very special time for children in the world, you know, because the specialists, the demographers, estimate that from this year, the number of children in the world will continue like this. It will not increase any longer. By the end of the century, we will still have 2 billion children in the world. When Doris was born is when the world entered into the age of peak child. The number of children are not increasing. Now,
but he'll talk about, and he talks about how it's possible that the population is still going to grow a little bit past when the children have stopped increasing, and that's just because those children are filling up the adult ranks. But basically, population growth has stabilized. So you can't really do much about the fact that the children are going to grow up, and so that increases the population, but basically otherwise it's stabilized. And so that's, for me, or for people concerned about the environment, that's the kind of the good news, right? That's the good news, that it's actually not a problem in the way that a lot of people think about it. And he also goes through in the video, if you're interested, survey results and stuff show that people aren't really that aware of this. Like, they think that people in a lot of different countries are still having like 5 kids when actually the majority are having 2 kids, and so on. So what I wanted, knowing this already before this meetup, what I wanted to consider is basic income going to throw a wrench in what's actually really good news, right? Because it's really good news that the population is stabilizing, I think, for sustainability concerns and stuff. Is there going to be something that totally changes this pattern if we did something as dramatic as a basic income? So that's kind of the first part of the discussion I wanted to have, is what are some reasons that basic income might increase population growth? You guys have some? I think Alex listed a few at the beginning, but like having more money, for example. Any others? Yeah.
If there's, like Alex said, if you're paying a basic income per child, then
right.
You're pretty much paying people to have children. But there's a lot of work in taking care of children, and you also need to find larger apartment buildings or houses or whatever, and you might not be able to afford such a large building.
Right. So you're saying on the one hand, if we set it up so that we're paying people per kid, that would definitely maybe incentivize more, and but on the other hand, there might still be some constraints like size of location and stuff like that. What do you guys think? You said you had some concerns in the beginning. I don't know if those.
Yeah, that was just that was not related to.
Not related to
that was related to just the idea of. I just think that the number of people that we already have in the world
you're concerned about
is
the number we already have.
far surpassing sustainability levels. That's my position, but that's not necessarily
related to basic income.
Yeah.
Do you think basic income would change that, the fertility rates in any way, or?
I think it's tricky. If we think about basic income realistically, we have to. I'm imagining one particular country, if it comes to that, if it's successful in instituting such a policy, right? And then how would people all over the world react to that? That's the question in my mind.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. Like, when I'm talking about population growth, it might depend on which country. And I guess I was vaguely thinking really broadly, like with that experiment of what if it's in the whole world?
Yeah.
How would that affect?
Right. That's what I'm saying. I'm not. If I'm living somewhere in, I don't know, Nigeria or something, and England institutes a basic income, So now there's an incentive for me to move to England.
Right, but it maybe doesn't affect your fertility in Nigeria.
Right. But it may, I don't know if it'll affect my propensity to have more children
Right,
once I move to England. Or
right.
it's unclear to me.
Did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking perhaps I could see it being a snowball effect. Perhaps young women are incentivized to have children at a younger age. Maybe I don't know what the right terms would be, but there'd be more generations in the world if women are having children younger, and that pattern repeats over a couple generations.
And do you think that would happen more with the basic income? Or?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I think if you were childbearing years, and you realize that you could potentially get an extra income in your name because your newborn child's not going to be able to do anything with that income.
So if there's
right
an
away.
income that comes with the kid.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
So now, if you put in age cap or
Right.
entry level age, then maybe that changes the picture.
Right. Yeah, and that's something I want to talk about at some point too. Is like how you might structure the basic income in different ways, thinking about these kinds of concerns.
Sure.
It's a good point.
A thought just came to me
okay.
actually.
Yeah, great.
This is a little bit actually quite provocative, but we
Go
have
for it.
to try to find some analogs, right, in terms of different payment structures and incentives. So this is totally different, but I can imagine from my example that I provided. So if I'm living in Nigeria now, all of a sudden, if I have a chance to move to England and get a basic income, so I realize that this is different in terms of basic income, how it's distributed, but it would be interesting to look at statistics of people on public assistance and whether they tend to have more children.
Like what? Like especially if it's
like on welfare in the U.S., for
right.
example.
Which is set up that you get more per child. Is that right? Or it's by
I don't.
child? Yeah. Well, that would make a big difference, probably.
Right, but even if it weren't, just in general, do poor people have more kids in the U.S.?
Right. Yeah.
Just forget about the fact that even if there isn't an incentive for getting more of a basic income for your kid, just in general.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah, do you want to
For welfare programs, they actually decrease the amount slowly per child. It's like for the first few you get some amount, but then it decreases per.
Right. Do you know if that changed at any time? Did they used to do it one way and then they did it a different way?
I think it changed in 1995 or 6 with the.
Welfare reform?
Yeah, welfare reform.
I ask because it would be interesting to kind of look at the before and after and see if the number of kids decreased for people on welfare once they started to decrease the amount per child.
And also, we already have something like a basic income for children with the the child tax credit.
Right. That's true. Yeah, so in some ways we incentivize having kids, but it's probably much lower than the cost of raising the kid, I would guess. So it's not maybe a huge incentive. But it is one, yeah. So I want to go back to your point though, because I want to make sure I understand what you would want to learn from the fact that people who are poor have more kids, or how that might relate to the effect of basic income. I don't know if you had more thoughts on that.
Well, my thoughts are fundamentally people want to propagate, and so if there's an opportunity to do that by moving from a poor country to a rich nation which provides a basic income, then logically I would have more kids.
You would think so, yeah, right, yeah.
So I guess I'm curious, is that really what people want? Especially if you're rich and you're doing okay, do you really want to have as many children as possible? Is that, we talk about, children become more affordable but when you have money, but when you have money, do you care as much about having as many children? Because I know there are some incentives that have to do with if you're poor, then children can potentially you'd get lucky and one of them is successful and brings money to the family, or that kind of thing.
Right. Well, yeah, this kind of gets to so the big puzzle from an evolutionary perspective is why people don't always have the most kids that they can. So this dropping fertility, and especially the fact that you have lower fertility in the wealthier countries, lower fertility within those countries, I think among wealthier people, is a bit of an interesting puzzle. And I think you kind of need the answer to some of that puzzle before you know the answer to this other question. Because one of the things that I'll list in a minute is like, it could be that right now, economic prosperity and like prestige and success are kind of their own things that we've evolved to care about, and they've kind of hijacked and they've become their own reinforcers. And so right now, the more that you delay childbearing and the fewer children you have, the more economic and often other kinds of success you can amass. But if that changes, that could really change like people's desire to have the most kids possible and so on. So I guess that's sort of part of what I'm wondering about. Yeah.
So I guess part of my question is the costs to having children are not just in terms of money. They're also in terms of, time and, how much attention you can give each child and that kind of thing. And giving someone a basic income doesn't really change that factor.
Although if it affects the amount that people work, it might affect it quite a bit.
Oh, if they're not at work, they can give their children more attention. Yeah, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm. And also, like with my grandmother, instead of her parents, she took care of the younger children in her family.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So that's also a possibility.
Right.
I guess going back to your point, I guess wealthy people may not be that big. The marginal benefit to having a kid, if you're receiving that basic income and you're wealthy, may not be an incentive. So maybe on the poorer end of the spectrum, you see a huge spike in people taking advantage of this incentive, getting the basic income, but at the wealthier end, you see not much change at all.
Yeah, that's right. So if we had like a basic income setup where you got money per kid, that would certainly make a bigger difference to poorer people. I would definitely think so.
Right.
Yeah.
But the marginal benefit, it's
wealthy,
not really there.
Make any difference.
Right.
Let me list a few, and oops, that was just an optional one, but we can. Oh, I meant to have these animate one at a time, but these are some of the ones that I was thinking about. So maybe let's think about the first one first. So like the first one is this idea that more money just means you can afford more children with a higher quality of life. So one way that would happen is that you would actually get paid per kid. But even if you didn't get paid per kid, you might think that, as you have more money, you can just afford to have more kids with a better quality of life. And a basic income fundamentally just increases, on average, the amount of money that people have, right? And so that's one reason that I think it might increase population growth. What do you guys think about that? And I'm just going to fiddle with this for a second while you answer. What do you guys think about that?
Well, you can always go buy food and things like that in wholesale and if you have 10 children, then you can buy, instead of buying the small package, you can buy the larger one, and then you can provide for all the children that way.
So like each kid costs less than the one before, is that the idea?
It's like the cheaper by the dozen or whatever movie.
It's like an economies of scale thing.
Yeah.
Do you think that affects the relationship between basic income and the number of kids that people are likely to have? Would it make it even more so that as you had a basic income, you might have more kids? Is that what you're thinking, or did you have a thought on that?
Well, there's still the issue of housing, and you can't like knock down the wall between two apartments or anything like that. So. True.
Although I wonder, like, if people have more money, then maybe they can incentivize builders to build more housing, right? So it might not be a complete constraint. What do you guys think?
Just on the housing thing, I think if people don't necessarily need to be living near where the jobs are as much, then there's more space available to build housing too, potentially cheaper housing.
Right. So that might create more of a relationship between the population going up with basic income.
Yeah, that could allow it to go up even more.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, because it relieves some of that constraint.
Yeah, and this would be true even if you don't give a basic income to the children, because it makes it cheaper to have a bigger home.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Or any home. Yeah.
What do you guys think?
And also, the larger home, the fueling costs are much higher. So that might increase like climate change and things like that. But also with more money, you would be able to buy solar panels and things like that.
You might be, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, thinking about this question, I would break it down into what is the effect on people living within the nation that is administering the basic income, and what is the effect on people in the outside.
Yeah, I guess I'm most interested. I'm happy to talk about both, but I'm most interested in the people within the areas that have the basic income, and in particular, to simplify it, maybe just assume that everybody in the world got the basic income. So it's just like, what's the effect of the basic income on these people's decisions to have kids?
Well, I have a question about what you said, Roma, which is, currently we live in a world where all of the nations are the nations that don't receive a basic income. Do you feel that one of the nations having a basic income would affect the fertility rate in the nations that don't have a basic income?
I don't know. The answer is I don't know, because I don't know how these people think. I don't know the stats. But if currently the situation in a particular nation is such that people consciously decide not to have kids because of limited resources, if they now see that in another nation that they can move to, they'll be able to get resources, then I would imagine that would create a reason for them to have kids once they move to this other nation.
So it's preconditioned on them being able to move to the other nation and receive a basic income, which basically means that the basic income is available to anyone in the world if they can all move to the place that's giving out the basic income.
Did I say something?
Well, if you can always have it so that only citizens can receive it, or legal residents or something like that.
So on this topic, actually just sort of related to exactly what you're saying, I had another clip that I wanted to show.
From large to small families. Almost all girls in Muslim Bangladesh, like 15-year-old Tanjina, go to school today. The government now even pays families money to keep their daughters on at secondary level. At Tanjina school, boys are now outnumbered by girls.
এটা কি পরিবার? এটা খাদ্যের অভাব হবে? আর এদের
You could hardly miss the point of this lesson.
অভাব পড়বে? এটা কি পরিবার? এদের কি সমস্যা হবে?
Education is effective.
I like this clip because I think it speaks to your point. Like, it seems like, at least in the way they're teaching people in the school, that a huge incentive to have fewer kids is the financial constraint. And that's one of the things that would make me concerned that, if you raise the amount that people have, it's less of a financial constraint. And especially if you're paid per kid, it's not a financial constraint anymore, right? And so it looks, at least from some of, I thought that was so fascinating that they're so direct in the schools. But yeah, it does seem like it's a financial constraint then. So I thought that was interesting.
Do you, Alex, think that there may be an effect on those people's propensity to have kids, even if they aren't able to move to this nation that's administering basic income?
The only reason why I would think there might be that kind of an effect is if they're expecting maybe the idea of a basic income to spread, so they're hoping that even though they can't get a basic income now, that maybe their country or a country they can move to will implement a basic income. But beyond that, I don't think so.
I've got one more possibility. It's a little less direct. Another possibility is like if you found a change in what prestigious people were doing. So like people, let's say that right now wealthier people don't tend to have a ton of kids, but if you had that switch and like the wealthier people were having a lot of kids, there's a general tendency in human learning to copy successful people preferentially. And so then even if you're not in that country, if you're copying, like let's say it's a wealthy nation that implements a basic income, and the wealthiest people in that country, like let's say it's the US, start to have more kids, then that could be copied by people who are copying just what the successful people tend to do. So I think that's an effect that could spread beyond the borders of the country.
Like there's this one representative, and I think it's like a southern state. It's part of the quiverful evangelical movement. It has 23 children. So if people copy them, then we have a real problem.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So I have a couple comments from
great,
the
your
live
mom's on
stream.
there.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So my mom said,
Hi, John.
Hi, Mom. So my mom said, having more money also gives people more options to do more interesting things with their lives and raise a family.
What could be more interesting? investing than raising someone like this guy.
Yeah. But hey, wait a minute. Finding meaning outside of the usual route.
Right.
So that was kind of her
that's
comment.
a great point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Alex Lancaster, the other Alex who comes sometimes.
Hey, Alex.
He says maybe basic income would mean that there may be less pressure to have more kids because of the idea that you need to have many kids to support you in your old age.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think a lot of this comes to like the crux of what ends up being the key factors that determine how many kids have, which I don't know all the answers to that, but like, you know, is it the case that people would still rather spend their time some other way when they have more money? You know, we don't kind of know. Yeah, certainly I agree that if the elder care thing is a factor, it should change. Although it should change and it should go down, there still could be the concern that you need somebody to be caring for you if you're like not able to do everything on your own, and maybe you'd rather have that person be a family member than like a stranger that you're hiring, but it would give you more capacity to hire somebody for sure.
In places like Japan, they're actually creating robots to take care of their elderly because there aren't enough people to.
Oh, that's great. That's so sad. Yeah, so, you know, I think always money gives you more options. So I would agree with this effect, but I would just add the caveat that there could still be a preference for, like, your own kids being the ones to do it, because it's a real relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really like my mom's point that money gives you more options, both in terms of, you know, how you can manage raising a family and how many children you can have, but also in terms of whether you want to go other routes with your life as well.
Right.
That's really,
yeah, exactly. So then it depends on where the motivation is.
Yeah, so it's hard to know what the balance is between those two things.
Exactly. Elizabeth, just to catch you up, did you see the Hans Rosling video?
Yeah.
So you know where the current data stands, and now we're just talking about like, well, what it says there, like how basic income might increase population growth, and then we'll go to the flip side of that.
And Elizabeth, this is Robert.
Oh yeah,
Hey.
this is Elizabeth.
Nice to meet you.
Robert, yeah. So let me put another one up there. We talked about this one too, which is you get both more money and more time. Again, both of those are great things, but it's possible people would want to spend both of those on more children. We don't know for sure, like your mom pointed out, but that's another reason that it could go up. You guys have thoughts on that, like the fact that people would have a lot more time to spend with their kids? Would that make a difference? Do you think in how many kids people wanted to have? This is sort of assuming that basic income on average leads people to work less, or fewer people to have jobs, or people to work fewer hours, or something like that.
It's really hard to say, right?
Yeah, right.
Maybe you enjoy spending time, and then you think let's have more. Or maybe you enjoy spending time with them, and you think this is enough. I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
So my sense is that we're not going to know about a lot of these questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I would imagine, you know, if we're rolling out a basic income, if it gets to be us, if we're the ones who decide, that we would maybe want to start by, you know, just guessing and saying, okay, maybe we don't give basic income to kids until they're teenagers and then phase it in or something like that, and then just see what happens. And then, you know, we can kind of tweak it based on, you know, what we're seeing in terms of how it's affecting fertility and all of that.
Actually, there's a study that if you don't let children spend money until they're later, they make poor financial decisions. So if you phase it in with, say, $25 when they're five, and then like 50 and whatever, then they'll be able to learn about how to spend their money more effectively.
You're true. Although the parents could either keep that money, or either way, parents could give their kids an allowance or something like that. But yeah.
Yeah, and we could set the norm, like this money is supposed to be going for your child as part of their education, you know, as money for them to spend. Right. And, you know, hopefully that will, you know, motivate parents to actually do it that way instead of just like withholding the money from their kids.
I guess anything that decreases the cost of kids, though, even like the things that are for their later age, like even if they start to get a basic income when they're older, that could still that still makes it easier to have kids because each kid is still less costly now. Because usually people have to factor in like paying for college or paying for whatever, helping their kids financially in their 20s and these kind of things might be part of the calculus. And so again, you're still making it cheaper to have kids if you give, like even if you just give them a basic income as adults, it has that kind of effect. But certainly less than if you give a basic income based on the number of kids for their whole life. You could even, if you were really concerned about population growth and didn't have too much political backlash, I guess you could even make the basic income lower for people per kid. That's more extreme than just not paying people per kid. But
you're saying reduce the amount of the basic income of parents as a response to them having kids.
yeah, I'm just saying, like, you have this incentive. for
Like the
everyone.
current welfare system.
I think that would be really unpopular, and I would probably try to avoid it unless we were really out of options. But if the basic income had a big effect, like destabilizing population growth again, so that it's like becoming exponential again and stuff, then it could be worth considering, like offsetting that negative effect with an incentive like that. There's other kinds of things we could do. I don't know that that's my favorite solution, but yeah. No.
So if we're living in a world where we already have too many people on the planet, I'm not convinced that we're living in that world, but I think Roma feels pretty strongly about that. Could we use some of this stuff to maybe, instead of just keeping population where it is, help it go the other way, like maybe stronger disincentives to have kids? Maybe bring 2 babies per mother down to 1 or something like that, at least for a while.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that seems like pretty hard to achieve, but I guess you could. Yeah. And some countries are seeing that, right? Like their population is declining.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess you could think about what's going on in those countries where that is happening and try to copy that. Yeah.
There's also the possibility of, starting space colonies and things like that. That's get rid of the excess population.
I'm a little bit with Alex that, like, I'm not so worried about going to 10 billion. I'm staying there. It seems manageable-ish. But what I would be worried about is, whenever you have exponential growth, it's just going up and up and up, like you saw in that middle period of time. So that's what I'm personally much more concerned about, because it doesn't really stabilize. So two is kind of a magic number for me, I guess.
Yeah, you could also have you could stop paying the basic income after the 3rd child or something like that, so that the more children that they have, the less they can afford them.
Right. Well, do you mean stop their own basic income?
No. You can only pay 3 basic incomes for the children,
kids,
so
yeah.
the 4th child doesn't get anything. The 5th
I see.
doesn't get anything.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I'd even be in favor of basically not paying a basic income for the children. Like, just pay a good, enough basic income for the adults that hopefully we can afford, such that they can pay as much as you can afford to the adults, basically. And then, like incomes function now, like you can choose to spend that on kids or not. My sense is if I'm worried about population growth, that way I'm not incentivizing having kids in any way. And in fact, in some ways, there's less incentive not to have too many because your money goes farther. But, yeah.
So would you just have it, turn on all at once when they turn 18, they get the full amount?
That I don't feel as clear about. I mean, I think the earlier back you said it, the more you're slightly incentivizing having kids, but there might be some benefits that counteract that, getting the kids gradually into independence, or in teenage years, occasionally minors want to emancipate themselves from their parents, and they have a little, so I don't know. I'd have to think about that. No, what do you guys think?
I almost think from a family dynamic, if the younger you start it, I assume as a child, one of the incentives to spending time with your family or being good to your family is that you depend on your parents for funds.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing when your parents are old and you want to take
Right.
care of them because their inheritance is coming to you.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're receiving an income, perhaps there's disincentive there.
So you'd be worried it might affect family relationships?
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
Right.
I hope humans can go
Yeah.
beyond that, but
Yeah.
I could see there being some
Right.
cases where the children no longer feel the need to be close to their parents because
Right.
they no longer rely on their parents.
Yeah, it's a good point. I would. One thing that would give me a little reassurance is when the kids are younger, they also rely on their parents for a lot of learning and other kinds of care.
True.
But you're right. When you get into the teenage years and stuff, it might be a little bit different.
Yeah.
And if you're paying basic income for the children, if they're still minors, it would still be up to the parents to kind of allocate that to them.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that would take away some of this effect.
Yeah, true.
That's true. Yeah.
I know, Alex, you're not into the social benefits of a basic income, but I just imagine this.
You do emphasize the economic, but economic benefits are social benefits.
Exactly.
Alex doesn't always say
The economy is the engine for social prosperity.
You and Adam Smith go.
Yeah. Anyway, what were you gonna say?
I was going to say that this is an optimistic scenario, but I can imagine this situation where once somebody turns 18, them receiving a basic income frees up all of this intellectual and productive capacity, because people would, at least in the US, for example, fewer people would go to college and more people would have the risk tolerance to experiment and contribute to the economy in ways that align more with their innate talents, perhaps.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Because as I'm thinking about when I was 18, it's like you're heavily influenced by your folks, and at the same time you think, well, I'm not able to take that much risk because
Right.
I don't have an income.
Right. Let's go to the live stream. We're missing that.
Yeah. So my mom said money gives options, but also reproductive control for
Right.
women also gives options.
Yeah.
My mom's generation, so my grandmother, would only get married and have children for the most part.
Right.
And religious beliefs play a big part too.
Definitely. Yeah, and some of these cultural factors, it's sort of hard to think about how they would be affected, like religion, by a basic income, I guess. But yeah, I'm gonna get. I have that on another list. Actually, that issue of reproductive control, I think, is really important.
Yeah, and then Alex said, so this is kind of related to, giving kids a small amount of money to learn how to be financially responsible. He was saying it would be nice to be able to phase it in. We could have financial advice be less about how to play into the debt-based banking system.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Like, right, I think what he means right now, Alex, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, is something like investing basically in stocks and bonds is kind of where a lot of financial advice goes, or just talking about credit cards.
Well, how to save money, how to
Right.
borrow, how to build credit, all that kind of thing. If you're just getting your income as a consumer, and that's like what you get as a consumer, then you can think about, okay, well, what are the things I should buy with this income that are responsible
how to
for
spend
me?
it well.
How to spend it well.
Right.
Yeah.
So, right, we don't really talk about that much more.
Yeah.
So another thing that I was thinking about is that right now, where you do have people having not that many kids, especially I know personally that the Western world and the wealthy Western world best, you have this incentive to delay childbearing till the last second and to like have fewer kids as a result, because that's how you get trained up for a more prestigious and lucrative job, and you also in general have the money sort of incentive we talked about. But it could be that if a basic income meant that fewer people were getting, like a smaller percentage of your income is coming from work, but probably by definition with a basic income, that maybe lessens the importance or the incentive to be delaying childbearing in order to get an education, in order to get a certain job. Which is a little bit like what you were saying. People have the freedom to do other things besides investing in education for a job. So this could include having kids. And I threw prestige in there too, because it's possible the culture would change so much that people also aren't looking for their primary purpose or their primary prestige in their job either. And so like maybe it's not so rigid where they have to like delay childbearing to the last second in order to be able to do the things that they want to do. So I think like a lot of these things, they're kind of all good things in and of themselves, but I'm raising the question of whether they would increase people's tendency to have more children. So that's kind of another one I was thinking about. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable. Makes sense to me. Less adherence to that rat race.
Because now, I mean, in extreme cases, you have a lot of women like myself and others, like certainly waiting well into their 30s to have kids, and then your option to have 10 kids is kind of more limited. Not that people tend to want to do that, but it's So that was another one, and then this is the effect I was talking about later. It's a little bit more removed, but like I said, if you have a change in the relationship between money and prestige and having fewer kids, other people might copy that. So then there might be like a secondary effect where now like the wealthy, prestigious people are having lots of kids and other people are copying that, and so that could create like more. Any other thoughts? I want to move to the reasons that it would not increase the population growth or even decrease it, but any other thoughts on this before we do that? I mean, obviously we can bring them up later too. Anything else on anybody's mind?
Well, I think these are all valid concerns, and like we've been saying, we don't know how much of an effect these things are going to be.
Yeah.
But certainly stuff to pay attention to.
Right.
I have a couple more comments from the live stream. So Alex Lancaster is pointing out he has an 8-year-old, so these issues are not just academic for him.
Nice.
He is very interested in money, the coins right now, and asks
Oh,
a lot
really?
of basic
That's so
questions.
funny.
And he asks a lot of basic questions that actually show how screwed up our system is in some ways.
Interesting. Alex, do you have an example? I'd be curious if you have an example of one of those questions.
Yeah, so I'd be curious to hear some examples of that too. Like what kinds of questions are they? And then another thing he said, and this might help us segue into the next part of the discussion. He says if basic income is used in general to further more activities that are less consuming overall, like arts, science, building community, then that would help versus encouraging buying another car, or I would add, commuting to work and building stuff that we don't need and creating industries that we don't need and all of that.
And Alex, do you mean help with population growth, or just help kind of with the environment and consumption in general, or I'm just curious.
I think he's talking about environmental
Consumption
impact.
in general, yeah, which is one of the things we're concerned about with population.
Exactly.
For sure. Okay. So the next question is, what are some reasons that basic income might decrease population growth? Yeah.
Well, I think I've already mentioned this, but just the idea that if people have more money, then their life can be about more than just having children. Like they have more freedom to decide how to spend their life, and they have other ways that they can derive purpose and meaning from their lives.
So maybe they would prefer other things.
Maybe they would prefer other things. Yeah, and I think this kind of has come up earlier in the conversation, but I think that's a really big thing, and I don't know how big that effect would be,
That's
but certainly something.
One way I might phrase that is like the opportunity cost of time changes if you have really great things you want to do with your time, and that might mean that kids are the thing you want to do, or it might mean that having too many kids you feel like you don't have time for those other things. Is that kind of your idea?
Yeah.
And I mean, sort of circling back to the inheritance question, on the flip side of like, if you know that you're going to have enough money to like sustain yourself, like there's no that absence, the incentive of like, oh, well, I need to have kids to take care of me when I'm old and I'm retired, and like, what if I need to go to an expensive nursing home?
Right.
That if you're like, well, okay, I'm going to have enough money, and we're maybe like pivoting toward, in part of having it become pivoting toward the society that's like, oh yes, we should provide for people sort of in general. That there's less of that.
Less
fear.
concern about kids helping you out later.
And so you're free to like choose to have kids like more for the sake of having kids, and less of be like, well, I mean, kids are nice and all, but mostly like I need someone to take care of me when I'm older.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think did Jo mention that before you came in? I think lightly too. Yeah, I think she was agreeing with you on that. Did you hear that?
With a basic income, you would be able to afford an education, and you wouldn't have as much time to have children if you're, going to college or whatever. So you would wait later to have children, and when you do, you'd be able to provide more per child, and those children will be able to accomplish more.
Right. So maybe the flip side of my third point here could happen, where people really want to like invest for a long time in a career, or go to college, or invest in a talent at least, or something like that, and they would have more freedom to do that. Anything else?
And I just kind of wanted to bring up Roma's point earlier, which is that another kind of a counterpoint to what Richard just said is that people might not have to go to college as much. If they don't have to like participate in this rat race where you go to college, get an education, get a job, et cetera. So maybe they'd have more freedom to get an education or go to college, but they might not actually choose to do that as much if they have a choice. And that's not to say, I think college is a very, very limited form of education. I think there's lots of ways we can learn, that don't necessarily have to fall into the restrictions of what college is, and I'm actually really excited about that. I think if you're learning for the sake of learning and not for the sake of the credential that you get from a college, that can kind of expand how we grow and all of that, and I think that's really exciting. But it also might not act as much as a disincentive to have children if you have more flexibility and you can have children now, get an education later, or anything in kind of any order.
That's a big concern. Let me show a video on kind of another interesting idea here, or another clip from the video.
Survival drives everything. let's go back into history. Why did the world population grow so slowly before 1800? Well, throughout history, all historical records show us that on average, 2 parents got more or less 6 children. But that looks as a very fast population growth. So why didn't it grow? Because 1, 2, 3, 4 of the children died before growing up to become parents themselves. People in the past never lived in ecological balance with nature. They died in ecological balance with nature. It was utterly tragic. But with the Industrial Revolution, this changed. Better wages, more food, tapped water, better sanitation, so medical advances, So why did then, from all these advances, why did population grow? Was it because they got more children? No. 1963, that year when I was at school, actually the number of children per woman had decreased a little in the world to 5. And the reason for the fast population growth was the improved child survival. 4 survived at that time. But still, 1 out of 5 died. That was still terrible. So it's only in the recent decades that most of the countries have taken big leap forwards in child survival and in family planning, so that we are now approaching the new balance. And it's a nice balance. 2 parents on average get 2 children that survive. We have families in a very happy balance. This is the most normal family situation in the world. And what does?
So, his argument is that one of the reasons people started having fewer kids is the reliability of the kids growing up to survival. And this may not be a reason that it would decrease population growth if we've kind of already hit the max, but I imagine there are poor countries where we haven't really hit the max in terms of child survival, right? I probably shouldn't imagine that, I should probably know, but anyway.
Yes, it's true.
So that's one of the ones that I had been thinking about. And now it's kind of a mystery to me as somebody who studies kind of the origins of human motivations, why this holds. Or another way to put it is, like I said before, from a purely kind of genetic evolution perspective, you would think that when 6 of your children survive, like if you can afford for them to all survive, great, you just have 6 of them and they all survive. That's kind of how you would think an organism would evolve, right? Because those are the genes that are going to be passed on. But anyway, it doesn't seem like that's been what's going on. And a correlation doesn't necessarily prove causation. It could be unrelated, that we now have more child survival and we now have people having fewer kids. But certainly he tries to argue this relationship. Yeah.
Is it possible that we evolved to not just to have 6 children, but to have 2 surviving children, and that was kind of like the optimal allocation of resources in the environment in which we evolved, in which case, if that's kind of like wired into us, maybe we're on average happiest with about 2 children surviving, and we were just, having too many children for a little while because, the mortality changed.
But why wouldn't we be even happier with 3 kids surviving?
Well, according to like the hypothesis that I just gave, the parents are happiest with 2 surviving children because that allows them to allocate resources optimally and give them parental attention optimally and that kind of thing.
Like a quality-quantity trade-off.
Right. So the optimum is like 2 surviving children. If you have 3 surviving children, then maybe you're not super unhappy, but it's not as good as 2, and 1 isn't as good as 2 either. Like that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that could be.
Yeah.
I think one thing that makes me, I don't know for sure. So you also find in nature that like when something's good, people and even animals often prefer more of that thing as opposed to being able to find that kind of balance. But I guess.
Well,
I guess another thing I would say is it seems like you might be sensitive to the cues of your own resources more, and at least the more resources you had, the more kids you would have, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's still kind of mysterious to me, but it's definitely an interesting idea. Yeah, Roman, did you want to say something?
So I think of these scenarios from the perspective of Dawkins and so the selfish gene.
Right.
So
that's the perspective I was raising. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying from that perspective is that somehow at the end it turns out that the parents who have 2 surviving children, those children are then better able to propagate their genes.
Yeah, that's what I was assuming.
as
Thanks for
opposed to
spelling
the,
that out.
which is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very interesting. One of the challenges about all of this information is that it's heavily reliant on stats that are actually hard to come by.
Right.
Like, for example, I don't know how to find these statistics.
Interesting. Yeah. Dr. Well, Hans
And you're a data analyst, so you know
Yeah,
a little bit about.
I'm not a good researcher.
Okay.
Yeah, so hard to come by, and also like often more correlational than causational, like I was saying, especially the time trends. Like we know that child mortality has gone down, we know that fertility rates have gone down, but we don't necessarily know that one is causing the other, right? Yeah.
Another reason for only having 2 children is that in the past you weren't as mobile. You couldn't go 100 miles away or whatever. So if you, like with deer in Yellowstone National Park, before they introduced the wolves, they were always in danger of starving themselves to death because they weren't enough food to go around.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because speaking of Dawkins, when you read him, he talks about how like if animals suddenly lose their competitor, their plants, or end up in a new environment where they don't have as much competition, like the population size just goes nuts. So in most of nature, this doesn't. What's happened to people doesn't happen, right? Like you have an ability for more kids to survive, but the population should continue to go nuts. So it's kind of strange that we've not had that happen. Like just in terms of comparison to other animals.
The deer don't have birth control.
They don't. So that's another possibility. Is like the mechanism by which we have the maximum kids is sexual interest rather than like thinking about having kids. So that's an interesting point. Yeah, they don't. But as far as I know, I don't know if anyone else knows about the deer, but so far as I know, they don't. Yeah. So interesting possibility. Back to basic income and this is like if there is some psychological response to your children surviving where you feel like you have fewer. This could even be things like what you were saying about like who's going to take care of you when you're older, like all these different factors. Then decreasing poverty might actually decrease the number of children because people who are currently creating part of that average by having more than 2 might decrease the number that they're having. Things like that. This could even create a slowdown or a decreasing of the population or slowdown, which is what Rolo wanted. This is one that I forget, did your mom bring this one up? I think Joan brought this up.
Yeah.
And other people, yeah. So and you just did. So obviously, like if access to birth control has certainly empirically been a really big factor in the number of kids that women are having. So speaking of statistics, like probably shouldn't ignore that. All right, and so anything that decreases poverty, my assumption is would increase access to birth control on average. Yeah. So that's another way in which it could actually decrease it. Or at least these are things that could be countervailing factors to the ones we listed on the other page. And then when women are more educated too, they tend to have fewer children, at least so far, empirically. And that's another thing that tends to go along with less poverty is more education for women. And like we talked about on the previous slide, this could change with basic income. More educated women or less poor women with more money might stop having fewer children. But for now, it's definitely been a trend. So that's an interesting thing too. Yeah.
So do we think the educated women are having fewer children because they're learning that having more children is going to cause them to have a scarcity of resources in their family, or do we think that it's something else?
So this is my guess, but I don't really know. My guess is it's a little bit different if you look like at the strata within, say, the U.S. versus like globally, looking at like education across the globe. My sense is like one of the first things that happens with this is access to birth control or information about it, some more control over when you get married, like you're not getting married off at 15 anymore. So like someone mentioned like the time at which you start having kids goes up. And you start to have the opportunity to get a job, which creates an incentive to do things like get an education, get your job going, and then have kids. So again, you delay your child. So like the marriage rate tends to go from 15 to 25 or something in terms of the age from the stats that I've seen when you start having women get educated.
So a lot of this has to do with the freedom to do things in your life other than find a man to have babies with because that's your ticket to survival.
Not even find. I think a lot of the times it's not so much up to you.
Or
if you don't have any bargaining power. So find, but also if you don't have any bargaining power, like you can less easily resist child marriage, you can less easily wait to have a marriage because you don't have a way to support yourself. So you might not have very many options besides getting married if you don't have education. Now, this one other factor that could go away with basic income is this incentive, like I said, to like get an education for a while and then get a job. So that might not hold, but some of the other things do, right? Like resistance, like getting married off before you want to. I didn't have this clip in there, but there's an interesting clip in the movie of like the 15-year-old girl talking to her mom, being like, "I can't believe you got married like 2 years older than I am," and like, "That's really crazy. I would never do that. I want to like go become a doctor or an engineer." And like her parents are really happy about that because the norms have clearly really changed in the culture. But that kind of goes along with this. And she's going to school. Her mom presumably didn't go to school for as long. Yeah, for sure.
There's also like cultural issues to worry about, like in Asian countries. There's an issue with like spinsters that you don't want to marry a woman after a certain age because they're not as fertile or something like that.
Yeah, and that always is a factor too. Yeah, for sure. But often these cases, like we're talking about people getting married in like their teens, so they've got a lot more time. Yeah. But I think that's a point. Like one of the reasons that the fertility rate might be so low across the world is that people are waiting like so long that they're actually not able to have kids anymore. And with more flexibility, people who want to have kids presumably won't do that as much. So that's another thing that could increase the fertility rate, I think, is like women being like, "Look, I have a basic income. I don't have to wait till I'm 38 to have a kid so that I can get enough money or whatever." Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, actually, in the example that you gave. Why are the parents happy? What has caused them to now think that this is becoming an engineer
it's so
compared to the past? Just from my uninformed perspective, it's probably because in the past you had a big family. Yeah, you had a lot of hands to help at the farm or wherever. And now, all across the world, generally subscribe to our Western ideals of becoming a specialist in a certain field.
So the jobs have changed. Yeah, I took this off because I wanted to add something to it, which I know when it loads, which is like fewer people in agriculture, right? Is kind of what you're saying. Like when you have people, when your agriculture is your main thing, like you might want more hands in the field. Is that kind of one of the things that you're saying?
I mean, I don't know what the dynamics are, or you marry your daughter off to, so that you get a dowry or whatever.
So quickly, a comment from the live stream. Alex was saying a basic income must go to individuals and not families, because then that gives people more freedom to like leave bad relationships and stuff.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Super good point. Yeah.
And I don't know how that directly relates to population growth, but maybe women who don't want to have more babies can run away from their husbands.
It goes back to the motivation question, but there is a clip that maybe you were referencing earlier, Richard, where one of the people that he has a video on is like a woman who works in kind of helping get birth control to different people, and it's like, I don't know if it's just a cover, but the woman that she's talking to is like, "Well, I don't really decide how many kids I have." So there's this idea of like agency can decrease and sometimes could decrease the number of kids that women have, and that's maybe part of the idea of like if you can lose the relationship, then
That's a good point.
I don't know what the evolutionary biologists say about like whether men have an incentive for their wives to have more kids or for women to have more kids than the women have an incentive for. I don't know the answer to that, what they would say, but yeah.
Men evolutionary have an incentive to have as many children with as many different women as possible.
That's certainly true.
Well, women have an incentive to have it to lock down one man and have him provide all the resources to her children.
Well, it can work out different ways, but there's certainly less payoff to multiple mates for a female because she tends to be the limiting factor for the rate of kids. But that doesn't mean that she has a less incentive to have a certain number of kids herself than like her husband would. That was more the question I was wondering.
So you're saying that a woman can't have more kids by being with more men, whereas a man can have more kids by being with more women, by having more partners.
Yes, I think that's kind of the root of the argument that people make around the evolution aspect.
There's actually a culture in Asia where the women it's a matriarchal society, and they don't know who's the father of the child. So
in China, the one in China.
Yeah, that one in China. And so they the men in the family provide resources to their female cousins and their
sisters and stuff. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yes, you see different kinds of structures. Yeah, it doesn't have to be that. For example, some people argue that this is kind of off topic, but some people argue that women have an incentive to have non-monogamy also, because then if you imagine a woman in non-monogamy, if she has some choice, which isn't always the case, but then she could choose to be either with the man who currently doesn't have anyone, or the really wealthy man, for example, who does have someone. Whereas if you add monogamy, you kind of take away that choice. So it's not super straightforward, like whether men or women have an incentive for like a monogamous or non-monogamous society. But anyway, that's not really that related to this topic, I think. Point. Decreased population growth. Oh yeah. So yeah, these were the ones that in particular I had thought about. I guess one that's kind of neutral is like in the video you see that there's clearly this like really strong norm being set in the schools. Like it's like you were saying, kind of like what changed the parents' minds, and like it's clear that the culture is like kind of trying to create a new norm around having fewer kids, and there's almost like social pressure to have fewer kids. So that's something that's a little bit independent of a basic income. Like you could still try to drum up that social pressure, even with people having more money and stuff like that. So that's kind of another lever that people might have available. Yeah.
So I was thinking you could, but maybe some of the arguments that you're using to try to convince people and sell people on this wouldn't work anymore. Like, oh, you're not going to have enough food if you have more children, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right.
But there's other ways to drum up social pressure.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
You could also argue that if you have a basic income, then you don't have to go to middle school or high school anymore. You can just be ignorant or whatever. But with the Bolsa Familia program in Brazil and whatnot, there's actually, you don't receive your quasi basic income if you don't get vaccines or go to school or whatnot. So you can do something like that.
Right. You could make it a little bit conditional if you wanted to. Or add extra incentives, like they were saying in the video that people are getting paid in Bangladesh to go to keep women in school, keep girls in school. Yeah. You could add like some kind of incentive to stay in school if you wanted to.
I think with respect to Bangladesh, they actually do have an overpopulation problem. I mean, it's like it's a pretty small country, and
it's densely populated. Yeah, but the population growth has stabilized now.
Right, but that doesn't make it easier for the people who are already crowding that small space, especially given the fact that they're going to be flooding increasingly more as time goes on.
Well, until a certain point, and then
he's talking about
flooding.
flooding.
You don't mean more people.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't understand. Yeah. I thought flooding with people or something. I misunderstood. Yeah, for sure. And I didn't take any clips from this, but if you're interested in the video, he kind of goes into some of like the concerns about what about the current population, even if it doesn't keep, even if we get destabilized, what are some concerns we have? So he kind of goes into that a little bit. But it's difficult. It's difficult to probably decrease it to one kid per person, although they could try, or whatever. Or moving people. Obviously, if other countries that were less crowded had more open access, there are certainly places that are not so crowded. That would help.
Yeah. I mean, this is a little bit off topic, but I think one of the ways we can address a lot of the impacts of climate change is by giving people more freedom to move to areas that aren't going to see as many adverse effects. So getting people out of those areas that are going to flood, getting people away from the coast, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm gonna add a topic for us up there.
So a good opportunity for countries to make money.
In terms of, you want to move here, you have to pay us or something?
Yep.
Yeah, and everyone has a basic income, so there's money.
It only works if you have a basic income on it.
Yeah. Well, some places doesn't I feel like New Zealand. It's not. I guess it's not so much. It's kind of like that. I think if you have like a certain amount of money that you want to invest in like property or something, like building something, that you can move there much more easily than if you don't have that. So I think some countries have that at like the really high income level. You can basically pay
like in the U.S. That's one of the things.
And when I was looking at Canada's immigration too, if you have a certain amount in the bank, it's easier. You get like points for that for immigrating.
Yeah.
So in some ways, we have not exactly paying them directly, but we have some of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and also I think strictly speaking, countries don't need to make money per se. Individual people want to profit, but the goal of the country and the government is to not to maximize kind of their own profit, but to maximize the profit of all the citizens and all the people and stuff like that. So I don't know that countries are even going to be looking necessarily to scrounge up incomes from people moving in and stuff like that. And just I feel like one of the most valuable resources in the world is human ingenuity and intelligence, and like if you get more people, even if not all of them contribute, just kind of by the law of large numbers, you're going to get some good intellectual contribution and human contribution. Yeah, and that's valuable. I think in the end, the country with the most people is going to win.
Like with Mr. Fuller said, that one person can create something that can provide for 10,000 people.
Yeah, and do you know in what context he said that quote? It was in a forum or a discussion about the climate and the environment, and he was talking about there being all these jobs that hurt the environment that don't need to be there. Yeah.
We actually did that discussion.
1970. Yeah. What's that?
We actually did that discussion featuring that article.
Yeah. We had a previous discussion about that.
There's a lot on the live stream here.
A lot on the live stream. So my mom said, I think many women would use basic income to choose not to have children, or not as many, especially in other parts of the world, since the U.S. is so liberated that way. And then Alex said, he was just talking about the immigration for Australia and Canada, how they have the point system, and they want people who are more successful or potentially going to contribute more and stuff like that. Finances do play a big role in some of those systems, way too much in some cases. I would agree with that final comment.
But that's just the way things are going to shake out. I mean, look at a country like China or Japan. They have pretty strict controls. I don't know so much about China, actually, but I would imagine that they just don't let anybody into their country. In Japan, for sure, and that's just geopolitics. I don't see that changing in the next 20, 30 years.
I do.
All right, but back to our topic. How would we want to structure? So we sort of got into this a little bit, but how would we want to structure basic income if what with population growth concerns in mind, and how would that affect how we wanted the payments to work, when we wanted them to kick in, any incentives or disincentives we wanted to add on to it. What do you guys think? Maybe let's go around.
Like I said before, you can stop providing it basic income after the third child, and so they wouldn't be able to provide for the fourth or fifth child as easily.
I'm really uncomfortable with the idea of structuring basic income to mitigate effects on population growth in and of itself, because I don't feel well, in the U.S., with a super high carbon emission standard of living, that feels like that maybe makes sense. The population growth is not the actual problem. I mean, at some point you get to a point where you literally can't fit more bodies on the ground, but it feels like the real concern is around climate change and how much resources those people are using. And so that feels like what you actually want to target, and that's also allows you a lot more nuance than targeting population growth in the wealthier parts of the U.S. versus in Bangladesh are going to have very different impacts.
You can actually, there's all these statistics and things that you can cram the entire world's population into Texas, and you can put all the trash into the size of Rhode Island or something.
That statistic ignores all of the resources that are needed for all of those people.
So Roma, how would you structure a basic income if you would at all want to have one? How would you try to, or even if you aren't into it, how would you want it to be structured to mitigate any effects of population?
So I actually agree with your point. If you'd want to do it fair, you just calculate in this given area what is the projected resource consumption of an additional child, and where in the area where it's really high, create a disincentive through the basic income, and where it's low, have less of a disincentive.
A disincentive to have a child?
Yeah.
to be clear, I'm not disincentivizing children.
Yeah, I got you.
I am.
And so what would that look like? Because in a way, I think you have to make a choice. Sorry to cut us off. We'll keep going on. But in a way, you might have to make a choice. For example, does the basic income go to children or not? And like, you know, you could see not giving it to the kids as disincentivizing kids, or you could see it as just not extra incentivizing kids. Like right now, your income is kind of independent of the number of kids that you have. And so I guess where would you fall down on that particular question? I'm curious, Elizabeth, if you
On
have
that,
a strong feeling.
I mean, I haven't thought about that like
Right.
deeply. I think like my inclination is to like is only give basic income to like people up like at and above the age of majority. I know there's like nuancing around that, but
Right.
that feels like sort of intuitively that it's like, okay, like you would like you give like a large pot of money to a tent. You're like, here, like we've agreed that like $10,000 a year is like the optimal amount to give everyone,
Right.
and you give that to a 10-year-old, and that's like very
Right. Or you could give it to their parents because they have the 10-year-old. I guess that would be probably more likely.
Yeah, it feels weird to me to tie it to like other things in that way, that I could see nuancing basic income and being like, okay, based on like, you know, cost of living because of reasons, like nuancing that some, but it feels awkward to tie it to very specifics, because then it's like, well, okay, like if your child, like, it's like, okay, like, but different children are going to have like different levels of needs, and so it's like, okay, like my kid has cancer and I'm getting the same amount of money as this other family.
Gotcha. So you'd maybe keep it simple and just have it go to adults.
Yeah.
Right. So when you're saying you would want to, you're sort of thinking, when you say not to disincentivize, you wouldn't want to do anything additional to disincentivize kids specifically, but if necessary to target carbon or something.
Yeah, like things around like carbon taxing or like incentivizing businesses to like do more energy efficient stuff. Like that feels like a much more efficient way to target the actual problem when we talk about population growth.
And then Roma, I also wanted to ask you, like, just to get a little more concrete, like what might you have in mind in terms of incentives or disincentives for population, for fertility or population growth?
I don't have any good ideas right now, but I'm partial to not giving the basic income to children, just to keep it to the adults until the kids turn 18.
Sure. How about you? You're up.
I would even take it a step further. Maybe not even give it to the adults. Maybe just. I mean, when you say adults, you assume that you mean the parents. Yeah, I wouldn't even give it to the parents. I would just say once you're 18 or of age, you're on your own, so to speak. Then you can start collecting.
I think that was the same thing that Roma was saying.
Yeah.
I think he meant like you don't get extra. Sorry, maybe I wasn't being so specific.
Okay.
Like you don't get extra for the kids that you have, which I should have said it like that.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
That's okay.
Because then that totally, I guess that segregates the incentive from the parents too.
Right. Exactly.
On to, but I also really liked your idea. That's very creative.
Is there anything else you would do to kind of structure the basic income in a particular way related to population growth?
Man, nothing that's already been said. I feel like your idea was hit the nail on the head.
Elizabeth's plan is a popular one. How about you, Alex?
Yeah, so I pretty much agree with Elizabeth 100%.
All right.
I think there might be something to be said for phasing in the basic income and, you know, having kids kind of get used to getting some money and then, you know, they finally get the full amount when they're 18. But generally speaking, I don't see a reason to provide extra incomes to families just because they had children. And, you know, like, I don't know what the effects are going to be. Usually when I think about basic income, I think about, well, what can the economy handle? And that kind of includes what can the planet handle? Like, what kind of resources do we have available to us? So the optimal level of basic income isn't just the basic income that allows people to buy what the economy can produce from them now, but it's the basic income that allows people to buy what the economy can sustainably produce, given the resources of the planet. So if, you know, giving basic income to children causes population to grow in such a way that it lessens the amount of basic income we can afford to give everyone else, I mean, really I'm kind of thinking in like trade-offs. So if the population is bigger and we truly are constrained by, you know, the size of the planet in terms of like the resources of the planet and stuff like that, or how many resources we can extract for how long, that kind of thing, then maybe a smaller population is better, and it means we could have a larger basic income in the long term, that kind of thing. So all these things kind of balance out, but I would say that, you implement the basic income and kind of see what's happening and see, what level you can get the basic income to without causing problems, and maybe if you need to make some adjustments. But I see no reason to start by having, kids get the full basic income right when they're born. I don't know that's useful.
And so it sounds like one thing you might do is have population growth or number of children per woman as a metric you would look at.
I would look at that, but I'd mostly look at the stuff Elizabeth is talking about and really kind of get that stuff right, because I think we're extremely wasteful on a per capita basis, and
Right.
that's like the main problem we need to address. And then once we've kind of figured that out, how to like live our lives efficiently given the population that we have, if we still feel like we want to curb population growth or like influence that, then we can start looking at those things. But I think it's too early for that. I'm not to say that like it isn't great that we're educating people about birth control. Like I think all the stuff we're doing now is fine for that. Yeah.
Can we go to Joan and Alex? We'd love your answer too. How would you want to structure basic income while thinking about any effects on population growth? Feel free to write something.
So it's going to take them a little while to respond.
Yeah.
But,
I can go while you guys are writing. So I agree with pretty much everything too. Like I think for me, I would also not give it to the not give people more basic income based on kids. In part because I am concerned about changing the trend we've seen with stabilization. I also think it's great to target the actual environmental impacts that you're interested in other ways if needed. I think one thing that I would emphasize you sort of weren't emphasizing, I would emphasize more to be a little bit on the ball about number of children per woman faster than you might think, only because like the effects can be seen at a bit of a delay, and there's this really big distinction between 3 and 2, for example, because one is starting to grow exponentially and the other is stable. And so because of the kind of exponential growth of population, it feels different to me than just like we're concerned of, its effects obviously are what we're really concerned about, but exponential growth seems unsustainable kind of in and of itself. Even if everybody's living really efficiently, at a certain point, because it's exponentially growing, it's going to be too many. And so that's, I guess, why I would be thinking about it earlier rather than later. And I wouldn't want to just kind of wait around while everybody's having three kids. Even now we can see we've reached peak child for now. It's stable, and we're still going to go from 7 billion to 10 billion, right? And so you'd have to be really confident you can afford that margin and stuff to ignore it if it went up.
Yeah, I think that's right. I guess I was more thinking if we're worried about the level of population we have now and want to like reduce it or something like that. But yeah, if women are having three children on average,
right,
then that's something we need to like.
Yeah, I think I'm with you in terms of like the population levels we have now. I think what I'd want to look for is whether the number of kids per woman goes up to 3, goes up to 4. Then we're going to see a really different kind of thing happening in the future. So
yeah, if basic income suddenly caused population to start growing exponentially again, then
I don't know exactly what I would want to do, but I'd certainly be concerned about it. Yeah,
I think for me the main thing is it's going to be tweaking the amount of the basic income.
Mm-hmm.
So taking basic income away from kids or not giving the kids the basic income might have some effect, but obviously parents having the basic income has an effect too. And if it really if the amount of basic income we're giving people really causes this kind of population growth, then maybe the amount is too high and not sustainable. So I would that's the main lever that I would use in adjusting these things.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What about everyone else? What about the possibility of using, for example, other things besides the amount of the basic income to counteract it? So for example, I was mentioning social norms before. Like you can have a sort of social norm where it's like generally considered you get a little more social reward if you have fewer kids. That's a little bit of a softer influence than the amount of money they get, and it can be somewhat effective, or there might be other kinds of programs that we could have.
Yeah, I guess I was kind of assuming a world in which we already have these social norms and these programs where, like all the stuff we're doing now is kind of continuing, and we're kind of doing everything we can in that department, and the basic income still has this kind of effect,
Yeah, kind of a tangent here, but I was just curious on your thoughts with a growing population and the increased chance of a large-scale war, thus taking the population back down to a lower level? I don't know. I know that's
Right.
that's a little off topic,
That's
but
a great question. So,
just a thought.
even with, so one thing that's interesting is that's often not known is that the violence like your chance of dying by violence per person has gone steadily down over the course of human history. So even though we have big wars every once in a while, in terms of those long-term trends that he's talking about, it's really actually not making that kind of difference.
Okay.
It's not really bringing us down to baseline. It'll bring you down a little for a while, but it's not really changing the overall trend.
Gotcha.
Because the overall trend, along with all of those other things, is that the violence per person is actually going down. It's hard to understand or see because in small-scale societies, you don't have massive wars that kill 1 million people, but there's not 1 million people. There's a small group of people, of whom, quite a good number are getting killed every year. Whereas for us, it's like once in a while giant things, but it's a much smaller percentage of the population.
Sure.
Does that make sense? So I don't know that that's going to, I wouldn't want that to be the population control, and I don't think it's going to be, unless something really, really changes.
Right.
Unless there's a nuclear war or something like that.
Right. That's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, I mean, that could do it, but I don't know if I want to bank on that for
Yeah.
anything. Like, I really hope that doesn't happen. Yeah, good question.
If you control population with like a one-child policy, like in China, there's the issue with like in China, they choose male children because of cultural issues, and so they kidnap people and the women in China, and like Thailand and things like that, and then bring them to China to marry their sons.
Oh, because there's an imbalanced gender ratio a generation later, right? Yep. There's certainly definitely issues with actually legally restricting a big number of kids. I think everything we've been talking about so far is kind of like more indirect kind of influence, like not telling people they can't have kids, but you give them a little bit less income or more income, it might change their decisions. But maybe somebody wants to put legal restrictions on the table. Whatever ideas. I personally don't feel that it's kind of come to that level of a dire kind of problem where I would feel it's worth the cost to like human freedom of a legal restriction.
What do you think about that, Roma?
Roma's our hardest line around population. So.
I was kind of spacing out what's the question.
This is your moment, Roma.
What do you think about like one-child policies and stuff like that?
I think they're great in cases where that needs to be done, such as in China.
Okay. Very straightforward and direct answer.
Yes, definitely. Let's see on the live stream. Do we see anything? They answered. So I don't know if you read their answers. Great.
Sure. So my mom said, I think basic income should be limited to 21 and over, actually, or 18. She agrees that it should be adults. Alex says that my approach sounds good.
And then his internet dropped out.
Yeah, maybe graduated from 16 to 18, phase it in, but not before. So they're both kind of saying no basic income for kids.
Mom agrees, yeah.
And yeah, my mom says yes because
before like 16 or 18.
Before 16, it's really for the parents. Before they're adults, it's really for the parents and kind of an incentive to have more kids. It could be a way to increase population if we need to. So if we ever get to a point where maybe the nuclear war is, too devastating, then
It's just a thought. It's just a thought I had. I know it's kind of out
if you
there.
kind of got the extreme balance of our pros and cons and some other ones, or like ups and downs. So in some countries now that are pretty prosperous, the fertility, like the population size is actually decreasing. And so if women like really wanted to use their freedom to not have kids, and that was like where the direction went, then that would be a less dire reason that you might be worried about population.
Right. So in a place like Japan, where they really are worried about the population shrinking, and they have all these campaigns for women go have children, that kind of thing. This could potentially help with that, depending on what the effects of the basic income are. If it tends to be more positive toward, paying people to have children certainly would. I don't think there's any debate that would incentivize more children.
One thing we haven't really said yet, I realized, or that I haven't brought up, is we've assumed implicitly or talked a little bit about a lot of the negatives of having a large population or an exponentially growing population, like the effect on resources. But there's also a lot of returns to intellectual and technological advancement. to having a larger population. So it's not like obvious that you don't just want the minimum population possible, because the more, especially if people are interconnected, the more people who can learn from each other, and the more kind of interconnected people you have in the population, the more your technology is going to advance and grow quickly, which is of course what we've seen over the course of the population being fairly large. And so, if the population takes a big hit, like we use fewer resources, but our capacity to use resources efficiently might grow more slowly or even go down. So there are some cases where when populations got too small on islands, like small-scale societies actually lost technology.
Like Easter Island.
That they had been able to use before, because there just weren't enough models to learn from with enough fidelity that it could be passed on. So canoes they used to be able to build or things like that, they just weren't able to anymore. So you don't want your population to get too small, actually, either. I don't know how those factors balance out with resource use, but just to put on the table that it's not all negatives for a larger population, depending on.
Yeah, so I was thinking for that effect, it's more than just like the number of living, breathing, consuming human bodies. It's also the number of people who have the freedom and the resources to kind of participate in this kind of intellectual community.
Yeah. It's the number of people in your. It's not just. It's like the number of people in your socially connected network, right, for whatever the thing is. Yeah.
So we could increase the population of socially connected, intellectually free, and capable people, while also potentially decreasing the actual size of the population of the planet.
That's true. Yeah. We're keeping it the same. Yeah, right. That's a really good point. Like, given the state of the world right now, a lot of people are not part of that social network that are alive and using at least some resources, and certainly could be, right? Yeah, so that's a good point. All right. Next question. How could basic income, this I just thought of during our discussion, but how could basic income affect our ability to manage the current size, the current population size, which is something like Rome was concerned about. Like let's step aside maybe from population growth and whether that will change it. Kind of imagine that the current trend continues, like we sort of stabilize at 10 billion. We stay at the peak child amount of 2 that we have now. Do you think there's anything about basic income that would, for example, make it easier or harder to handle on the planet than the population that we have?
Well, I think if everyone has the resources and the freedom to participate in whatever system we have, it becomes a lot easier to kind of organize policies and implement policies if everyone's kind of capable of participating in the system. So I think that's a big part of it. And then also just in terms of using the basic income itself, like I was saying before, modulating the amount of the basic income to potentially, slightly adjust the incentives to keep the population where we want it to be. We might want to use other tools for that, but you could potentially use the amount of the basic income for that effect.
I guess, yeah, go ahead.
So is the question, what will basic income's effect be on current population size?
I think I did phrase this question beautifully. So let me kind of re-emphasize, go with where I was trying to go with it. So I was thinking, for example, on the one hand, people with more money might use up more resources. This is now about kind of like the impact of the population as it stands. People might use up more resources, but they also might use resources much more efficiently, not commute to jobs they don't need to have, be able to invest in solar energy. I was more going that direction with it, okay. As opposed to the effect on population size, which we've been talking about. I was kind of switching to this issue of we have a certain population. It's using a certain amount of resources right now. Are we concerned that a basic income is going to mean that, so for example, a small percentage of the population uses up a lot of the resources right now. Are we concerned that giving more people money is going to make things worse? Do we think it'll make things better? How, those kinds of.
So how to manage our resources given the current population?
Yeah, that's a better way.
I think this is a very interesting question because from how I understand basic income, one of the benefits is that we give people money and then we let them spend it and how they want to, right? We're not dictating how they spend it, right? And it's a double-edged sword because of this question. it goes back to probably values. How will a person spend this money? Are they just going to go out and buy cases of Coca-Cola with this money, or are they going to go to the library, go to the bookstore, and buy books that will cause them to be more productive members of society? So the answer to this, I don't know. I would want to see some sort of research that compares these types of these actions and what effect they have.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I would say that it's less about values and more about markets. So basic income funds the market economy. So we can ask ourselves, to what extent are markets efficiently allocating resources? Now, certainly there are some resources that it makes sense to centrally manage, and there are others that it makes sense to leave up to the markets to allocate efficiently. But like the Coca-Cola example and the values question, that kind of falls under the area of markets. Like, are people gonna is people buying Coke in like a free market optimal, or maybe do we need like a soda tax or something like that? I don't think so. I think basic income, because what it does is it solves the problem of how to get money to consumers. What it does is it allows the markets to work as efficiently as possible. And then if we notice certain things in the economy or in our society that are inefficient use of resources, or things that are better to be centrally managed, or disincentivized or taxed or that kind of thing, we can add that on top of it. But I think basic income at its core, in the sense that that allows the markets to reach its full potential, it allows us to manage our resources more efficiently.
How would this specific example, what would this given person's decision making, how would the resource management be improved through basic income?
So now this person can decide how they spend their money in the economy, and decide what they want to buy from the markets. So the idea, ultimately what we want is we want resources to be managed in such a way that there's the most prosperity possible in the economy, and that has to do with everyone being as well off as possible. So where you want markets is when people's individual decisions tend to be the things that maximize their own prosperity. So to the extent that the basic income is allowing this person to maximize their own prosperity through participating in the markets, then it helps resource allocation with that person. But some people might, there might be some markets where people are doing the wrong thing, like buying too much soda or something like that. So I would say that's something that we would want to address separately from the basic income. And that's something that's true of consumer spending anyway. Like, any consumer can buy too much Coca-Cola or something like that. So this is, yeah.
Just so I'm clear, are you guys talking about too much from the perspective of the resource use of Coca-Cola, or just like it might be bad for them as individuals, or?
Yeah. I think of all of this as kind of a resource use. Like, if we're really wasting all our food production on sugar fields for building soda, then that's a problem. But I think it's more a problem that we're wasting the resource of human health. So if people are less healthy because they're drinking too much soda, I think of that in terms of resources as well.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Although the latter gets into like interesting questions, philosophical questions for me about like how much you should try to limit people's preferences or choices, or
Yeah.
You could go really far with that, and you don't want to go too far with it.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to kind of decide, but there are some things that are obvious that need to be kind of centrally managed, and then there's a whole gray area, and there's plenty of debate to be had on all the in-between stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, Richard. Sorry.
Historically, wealthier societies and a population with a basic income would obviously be wealthier. They are more open to different ideas and different peoples and the more interchanging between different cultures and whatnot, the faster the advancement of technologies, and the different philosophies and things like that that can be created, but with poor societies tend to have, like in the 1930s during the Great Depression, hemlines went up from the 1920s when it went down. I mean, in the 1920s when people were like gulping goldfish and weird things like that.
So you're
I remember this.
Wait, what was the goldfish thing?
That was
I remember
that was a trend. They like
that was a trend in more recent times.
no 1920s.
1920s. Oh yeah.
And they were,
It is.
So are you saying like people are more risk averse when finances are more scarce? Is that the idea? Yeah. So you might be more open to new changes technologically. Yeah, that's a good point. One side note on the resources of like human potential being wasted is like, just because some of you watched this video with Hans Rosling, like it really stood out to me when he was interviewing the person who really wants the bicycle. Do you guys remember that? Like there's this person who really wants a bicycle, and they're walking like hours a day to get to market, hours a day to get into things, and it's just like, first of all, that walking hours a day is super inefficient. Just if you think about that as a social efficiency of their like time and energy. And second, like the whole, no offense to them, but the whole small scale farming enterprise that they're spending all their time on, from a particular perspective, could be seen as inefficient. Like in the sense that you could probably have a large scale farm with one person making all of that food, and then these people could do small scale farming if they wanted to, if they had a basic income, but could also choose to do other kinds of things. So it was just an example that stood out of the kind of points Alex often makes in this group of like, the economy is not operating efficiently. Like all of these people's labor is going towards things that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. Put another way, if you gave all these people a basic income, they would be able to pay for food that was like produced at a larger, more efficient scale, if that's kind of what you're into in terms of carbon emissions or other kinds of things.
Yeah.
Just a thought, if you happen to watch the video or you already watched it, that stood out to me. I don't know if you guys agreed or disagreed with that, but yeah.
I do want to say that if I understand basic income correctly, the wealth of a nation is not going to be changed whether that nation administers basic income or not, because basic income is predicated on the idea that we can institute a basic income if there's enough productive capacity in the country, and that's what I equate with wealth, not the money.
Yeah, I think that's how Alex would usually define it. I think many people would define wealth as the current production, but if you're defining it as the productive capacity, I think that's the same as how you would think about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we tend to measure the wealth of nations in kind of like GDP and that kind of thing. And even when it's not GDP, when we're thinking about of real output, we're thinking about the stuff that's actually being made for the people living in that country. If the country is producing at half of what it could be producing, then I wouldn't say that the wealth of the nation is that full amount. I would say that it's the amount that we're actually producing. So a basic income, in that sense, would increase the wealth of the country by inducing productive capacity that's not being used or not being used efficiently.
We think most likely.
Well, there's no if your economy is already producing at full capacity and you give people a basic income, so consumers are spending more, then you're at capacity. So there's no way to produce more. So what you're going to have is inflation. So you can't really have a basic income if your economy is producing at full productive capacity.
Joan had to go.
Okay, bye, Mom.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just noticed that.
Yeah, and I just want to say one more thing, which I forgot. So go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
No, I just noticed that Joan had to go, but there wasn't much more there. Other thoughts on this question or related questions before we wrap up, or just in general, like questions of basic income and population. You want to go around? I love going around.
You can go around.
Let's go around. All right, some final thoughts on basic income and population after the discussion. Or how about this? Also, start with, has anything in your thinking changed based on the discussion?
I don't really think my thinking's changed all that much.
This is a dangerous question.
You're gonna get a lot of no's.
Yeah, I'm gonna get a lot of no's. It can be hard to remember, actually, I'm realizing. Yeah.
Well, populations would. I still think that populations would probably decrease because the parents would have more resources per child, and they wouldn't need as many children to further their lineage or whatever you want to call it, because there would be fewer deaths. Like hundreds of years ago, average was 6 children, but 4 of them died. But with better vaccines and things, you wouldn't lose nearly as many.
I don't think my thinking about anything has changed in this hour and a half. I was thinking about your point about like the bicycle story and the video, and thinking about to the tension of what do we call efficient? And so in some ways, yeah, it feels really intuitive that large scale farming is more efficient than subsistence level farming. But then thinking about that, one of the other tensions in the video, well, okay, so then, if Bangladesh just unlocks all of its coal-based power, that's not a positive thing. And obviously, I mean, there's it's unfair for people in the top 1% to be well, you can't do the terrible things that we're doing. Yeah, right. We're going to keep doing them, but we're not going to let you do them. But thinking about what efficiency means, that if it's okay, subsistence level farming is inefficient in some ways, but you're also not destroying the ozone layer, and so what do we?
It depends on how you're doing it, and sometimes it has more carbon emissions than small scale farming. Depends on how small scale, I guess.
Yeah, I think and there are ways that you can, with economies of scale, do things in efficient ways that are a lot more environmentally friendly than okay, we each have our own little personal gas guzzling tractor.
Exactly. It depends on what you mean.
But so thinking about is how do we define efficiency, or is efficiency always
and
the best
there's also
metric?
Resource use versus I was also kind of thinking of personal human potential to contribute in different kinds of ways, which is different than the resource use a little bit too. But good point.
So I just wanted to add another inefficiency of small scale farming is just the land use. So if you're slashing down rainforests and all of that because you're farming in a way that has less yield per acre or whatever, and that food could easily be produced, maybe not even by coal in your own country, but maybe America could just slightly scale up their farming, or maybe there's food out there that's already being made that just isn't being distributed to the people who are hungry, and that kind of thing. I think there's a lot of, so when I think about inefficiency, it's about wasting resources, and that includes the stuff like causing more pollution and all of that.
And you could plant trees on the land, I guess. That helps offset carbon emissions if you're not using it for farming.
Yeah, let the natural environment come back. Yeah.
You can also do things like hydroponics and build your farms in a skyscraper, and so you don't need anywhere near as much land, and you can return it to forests and things like that.
Right. So good question overall.
So that's helpful. I'm thinking about efficiency more broadly, because I think it's really easy to just be oh, well, how can we, with the fewest amount of people, hours, and dollars, do this? And it's cool story how you're really ruining the environment and that, but you're efficient on these two metrics.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point, and one you were talking about earlier too, just with what do you really mean by the productive capacity and making that the kind of sustainable productive capacity, and how do we think about that? Final thoughts.
More than anything, just this discussion has created more questions in my mind. Maybe what if I'm wrong about the population growth or the dangers to the environment? That's an interesting thought. Then I'm thinking, what would this actually look like if we've been speaking about this in the abstract with basic income being administered to the entire world, but I think if this actually happens, it'll probably happen on a local level, right? If you are successful in creating it here in this area, then what would that look like? Would that cause people from other parts of the country to move to this area, perhaps? And what would the effect be on their propensity to have kids? Also, in discussing the resource use, another question that came to my mind is, I have absolutely no idea whether areas where resources are depleted, such as in Africa, and people, at least my perception is that people have a lot of children, whether that is more harmful to the environment than us here in the West, where people have fewer kids, but resource use is higher through other means. I don't know. So, and that kind of brings me, because I have actually put in some time to try to find literature that addresses this. But this actually highlights the what I mentioned before, is that this is all of these stats, and there's so many feedback loops that this whole topic is actually very complex. And if anybody knows a good book that has citations and so forth, then please share it, because, for example, even him, I'm skeptical because I don't know where he gets his information from.
He has a book out that you might like that probably has the citations and stuff. This is obviously more focused on presentation, but I don't know, have you read his book yet?
Factfulness. I have not read it, but I gave it to your dad for his birthday.
Oh, that's what I'm thinking about. He is an academic, so presumably he has done
He works like Gapfinder or whatever, like the
Gapminder.
That seems like the way he talks about it is sort of like a warehouse of a lot of these statistics. So I assume they have like a website with reports with citations.
Right. Good point. Good point.
Yeah. Unfortunately, he's passed away now, but yeah, he's done. You should check out the website at the very least if you want his sources.
I also super recommend for youth in particular, like you might enjoy the entire video. For example, he goes into like the number of children that people are having on average in places like Africa, and even there, the most common number is 2. So there's a lot of misperceptions that I think a lot of people have about how many kids people are having around the world. And I was really surprised to see like how low the fertility rates were really everywhere. So that's kind of interesting. I think he points out that it's a big shift that's happened recently. Yeah. The argument is kind of that the Industrial Revolution happened and more, and then sort of after that, we in the West, for example, started having fewer kids, and that's like kind of a delayed effect, but it's happening elsewhere in the world too. But anyway, you might like it, the video, in addition to the book.
All right. So this is my first meeting.
Welcome.
And so,
usually this guy's talking.
Thanks for having me. So I do feel enlightened in the sense that I did learn a little bit more. When I came in, I was thinking basic income as in just like a handout, but you talked about it in the sense of a mechanism to unlock potential capacity that's not being used. So I appreciate the distinction there. So I did learn that. As far as the population is concerned, though, I mean, it's kind of one of those only time can tell things. I really don't know what to think if a growing population will have detrimental effects or not. But it does seem like we've reached a point of stability. But at least I learned definitely something about basic income in general, and seems to be more advanced than what you hear in the news.
You should come back.
Income. Oh no, I will.
Usually it's more of that and good stuff.
I did. I really enjoyed this. I really did. So thanks.
Definitely. Yeah. Alex?
So yeah, I mean, these discussions are always enlightening to me as well. And we talk about stuff that I haven't really thought about that deeply. Like I haven't gotten deep into population stuff before, and as we talk about this, I kind of like in my head I fit it into the model for basic income that I have, and sustainable productive capacity and all of that. So it's really useful to have these kinds of conversations.
Right. Alex, we'd love to hear from you too. And he did have a comment before. He was very much on the same page as you, Elizabeth, again, as to thinking about efficiency with respect to the goals that you're most interested in, and what is that definition. So, adding that. So for me, I like this discussion a lot. I don't remember everything everyone said that I was like, oh, that's interesting. But I think I've like become a little more ambivalent as to like which direction the basic income would tip population, because I think I came in with a more stronger affiliation with some of the reasons that it might increase the number of kids people want to have. But I think I heard some really interesting points from Joan and from people in the room and Alex and stuff about how it's not so clear, like how people would choose to use the flexibility and people would choose to use the time. So I think I'm just like slightly more ambivalent now about which direction that would push things. But I think I still feel pretty strongly about, I guess, what most of us agreed on, which is not necessarily paying people extra for having kids per se. I think that alone might just mean that we basically keep the status quo, which I'm pretty happy with in terms of it being fairly stable. Yeah. So thanks, guys. We're out of time. Well, thanks a lot.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. And next week we are talking about the Venezuela crisis and hyperinflation
This is
and
great.
shortages that are going on there. So yeah,
Back to the fundamentals.
Yeah.
back to
we'll
the fundamentals.
be back
Yeah.
to Alex's economics next time.
No, this is
Not
great.
that we're ever really far from.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you guys. Yeah.